Accord Financial is an asset-based lender doing transactions in the lower middle market. Our sweet spot is between $1 to $20 million in funds employed. We offer receivable financing for both domestic and international eligibility, inventory revolvers, senior stretch, and term loans against machinery and equipment. Our relevance in the independent sponsor space is that we are asset centrist, meaning if a sponsor presents us with a target company and in the eligibility calculation, it translates to the majority or all of the purchase price, we allow the acquirer to leverage the assets of the target company. So equity check is not a requirement for us. Our typical deal contains no financial covenants, but if it does, it is very light. We have quite a few success stories funding independent sponsors acquisitions in the last several years. They like us because we don't require equity check, and another aspect of why they like us is the speed and certainty of closing. We attribute this reputation for the fact that our business model does not employ BDOs. So when a sponsor presents us with a transaction, they will be speaking to a decision maker who is also a member of the credit committee. We are 35 plus years in business, publicly traded in the Toronto Stock Exchange with strong balance sheet. We want to remain relevant and viable for the independent sponsors as another source of acquisition financing, and we hope to establish dialogues with sponsors who may find a mutual fit with Accord. Thank you.
Great. Now I'm going to pass it off to Chris Sheeren of Huron Capital, who's today's moderator, and I'll let him take it away.
Great, thanks, Nick, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We will try to keep things moving in on time and wrapped up by the end of the hour, just to make sure everyone can get on with their day. But I do thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. The goal here is not necessarily to preach to the independent sponsor community, since most of you, some of you maybe on the line, are independent sponsors. But rather, we want to kind of just give an overview and an introduction to those who maybe don't as often come across independent sponsors or have not worked as much with independent sponsors. So we're going to be covering things like, what's an independent sponsor? Who is this crowd? Where are they coming from? How does an independent sponsor deal work, and how are independent sponsors compensated? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the independent sponsor model? And also maybe talk a bit about how an independent sponsor can compete with a funded private equity sponsor. And so to address this, we've got 4 different independent sponsor groups from a few different parts of the country. I think we have the New York area and Dallas and Chicago represented here, and firms of some different shapes and sizes. So I think we have a nice cross-section here. Real quickly, and I'll let each of these 4 introduce themselves individually, but just to make sure we're going in order to the slides, I'll give you the Huron overview first. But just quickly, our panelists today are Chris Freeburg from Skyline Global Partners in Chicago, Grant Kornman of MTN Capital out of Dallas, Conor Mullet from Red Oak Growth Partners. Conor's based in New Jersey, and Dan Negrea from MTN Capital in New York City. First on, again, just to get myself out of the way, and then I will shut up and let you hear from the experts. But Huron is a private equity group based in Detroit. We've raised over $1.1 billion over the last 15 or so years across 4 different funds. We invest in companies in 4 sectors: niche manufacturing, consumer, healthcare, and business services. And these are companies generally with $5 million plus of EBITDA, anywhere in the U.S. or Canada. We've done 4 independent sponsor platform deals in our history, including one of our more recent ones, a company called 6 Month Smiles, which we did with an independent sponsor in New York. And you want to go to the next slide, Nick? Just real quickly about me. I've been with the firm since 2010. Came out of the turnaround consulting world, but have moved on to hopefully brighter skies here at Huron as we invest really more in healthy, mature, profitable businesses. So first, again, we want to go through. I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves, and we'll start with Dan Negrea from MTN.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dan Negrea. I am one of the co-founders of MTN Capital Partners. We started our firm 10 years ago. In this 10 years, we've done 14 transactions totaling $500 million. We have 10 professionals in our firm, and the way we differentiate ourselves is primarily through a strong origination effort. We believe very strongly that in order to make great investments, you need to have plentiful choices. So in order to find very good deals, we want to see a lot of deals. So of the 10 people in the firm, 7 are involved in origination. 5 of them are covering the investment banks that we cover geographically, and the other 2 are involved in a relatively new effort here at MTN to generate deals through corporate executives. So that's the 5 plus 2 in origination. The other big difference, and more of this later, is we believe very strongly that one of our value addeds is to have in every single transaction in which we are involved an industry expert. This is typically a corporate executive, sometimes retired or semi-retired, who provides input during the due diligence phase, and after we acquire a company, will join the board, although in 2 occasions they actually joined management of the company. We have done all these deals so far partnering with private equity firms. We've done 2 platform acquisitions and 3 add-ons with Incline Equity Partners, which is the old PNC Equity Partners, 2 platforms with Argosy, 1 transaction with RFE, and a platform and an add-on with Angelo Gordon, among others. And a new effort with us currently is to develop relationships with family offices where we believe that we can bring a lot of value. So that's it about MTN. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And next we have Conor Mullet from Red Oak.
Thanks, Chris. Conor Mullet with Red Oak Growth. We're based in New Jersey and Manhattan. We've been in business a little bit over a year. My partner, Rich, and I were formerly general partners at another committed fund called Updated Partners, where we'd been for over 10 years, and set up the firm last year, I guess the end of 2012, closed our first transaction last summer. Everything that we look at is in the software, technology, and business services space. You know, very much of a lower middle market focus, which is where we thought, you know, there was an interesting opportunity for us with our strategy. So targeting companies with 2 to 10 of EBITDA, enterprise value typically in the $10 to $75 million range. We'll invest anywhere really in North America, and we've historically also successfully invested in European countries, but the focus here is predominantly on North America.
Great, thanks, Conor. Next we have Skyline Global Partners, Chris Freeburg.
Great, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Skyline Global Partners is a boutique private equity sponsor firm based in Chicago. I co-founded the firm 3 years ago with 2 partners, Ross Christensen and Sachin Gupta. We focus exclusively on the lower middle market. We pursue buyouts, recapitalizations, and growth equity investments. We're generally looking to invest 10 to 100 million of equity per transaction. We see companies with revenue of 20 to 100 million and EBITDA of 15 million. The industries in which we invest include healthcare, business services, manufacturing, software, consumer products, and food. We currently have 2 operating partner-led initiatives at present where we partner with operating executives who have very strong industry and operational expertise. Those 2 initiatives right now are in the payments and financial technology arena, as well as in marketing services. Finally, per the name of our firm, we like companies that are global or that aspire to be global in nature. My partners and I previously spent several years at a private equity firm in Chicago that was investing globally. So we have a network of global relationships that we like to bring to bear to the benefit of our portfolio companies and equity partners.
Great, thanks, Chris. And then finally, we have Grant Kornman at NCK Capital.
Thanks, Chris. NCK is based in Dallas. We're a little different than some of the other firms here on the call today. We're family owned and operated. The firm was started by my brother and I. All of our current portfolio companies we founded and built from scratch. We're a little bit newer to the independent sponsor model. Middle of last year, we decided we'd like to pursue a more buy and build strategy where we'll write a check and bring in partners for the difference. Between my brother and I, we have a lot of experience both running companies and investing in them. We're focused in the lower middle market. We like companies with $2 to $10 million of EBITDA. We do have a little bit of a geographic focus. We like to have our companies close to home. So we focus in the Southeast, Southwest, Midwest, and mountain regions. Being from Texas, we really like opportunities here in Texas. We think it's a great state for business. It's a growing economy, very business-friendly environment here. We focus on a couple core industries, restaurants and hospitality. We like alternative and consumer finance, and we like service-based business, whether they're industrial or business services. And we'll look forward to continue the conversation with other folks after this call.
Great, thanks, Grant. To get us started here, I've asked Dan to prepare some kind of higher level descriptions of just what an independent sponsor is, and maybe some thoughts on kind of again who populates this community, and maybe some quick thoughts on kind of where he has seen some trends over the years as Dan's firm has been active for a number of years here. So Dan?
Thank you. So a lot of people are doing quite different things, and they still call themselves independent sponsors. So the way I'm thinking about the business is a spectrum where there are people at one end of the spectrum, at the other end of the spectrum, and then lots of variations between the two ends of the spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum is what I would call the entrepreneur independent sponsors. These are independent sponsors who typically are in smaller firms, one member in the firm, or maybe two, or maybe three, but they do smaller deals. They get very much involved in the management of the company, and they don't have a lot of investments, and they pay a lot of attention to the investments that they have. At the other end of the spectrum, I would call them the quasi-private equity firms. They think of themselves more like a private equity firm with lots of investments, larger deals. These are larger firms with more members. And they are involved less intensely in the operations of the company. Trying to put this in a picture, here is the entrepreneur. It's a small store, watching the store, and the proud owner in front of the store. The quasi-PE, they think they are more like Henry Kravis of KKR, wearing a tuxedo with a trophy wife who is taller than he is. By the way, if you don't like my jokes, these are the only jokes that I have, so you are safe beyond this point. Trying to put the spectrum in perspective, let's start with the size of the deal. So the entrepreneur will do deals with companies with $3 million in EBITDA or less, the quasi-PE $5 million or more. The deal monitoring, very active for the entrepreneur, more PE style for the quasi-PE, meaning quarterly meetings, monthly calls. The capital partners involvement, that's the source of capital for the independent sponsor, very limited for the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is leading the due diligence, the monitoring, and the exit. In the case of the quasi-PE, the capital partner is the key decision maker, and the independent sponsor is the junior partner. The source of capital are different. Typically for the entrepreneur, they're high net worth individual, family offices, very often personal capital. For the quasi-PE, it's more PE groups, control mezzanine groups, and family offices. Skin in the game, since the entrepreneur is making all the key decisions, there is a requirement for a meaningful amount of investment. For the quasi-PE firm, less so because the capital partner is the key decision maker. Or to put it differently, the entrepreneur has all the eggs in one basket or in few baskets and watching the baskets very carefully, while the quasi-PE has the eggs in many baskets. On the next two slides, I'm trying to show the difference in the case of the entrepreneur and in the case of the quasi-PE in terms of the role of the two at different stages in the transactions. As you can see, the independent sponsor, if it's in the entrepreneur case, has full responsibility or main responsibility at all times, and the responsibility of the capital partner is limited. In the case of the quasi-PE independent sponsor will find the transaction, and that's his responsibility because nobody else is involved. But once a capital partner is involved, then it's the capital partner who is the decision maker. And the independent sponsor is involved, but in a junior partner capacity. And now I would like to make three predictions. Number one, the independent sponsor business will continue to grow. There are lots of deals, lots of intermediaries who work on these deals and make them available. Lots of professionals who want to be independent sponsors and a lot of capital available. A very interesting trend, and we are very intimately involved in it, is the use of industry experts. There are literally thousands, actually tens of thousands, of highly qualified corporate executives who are available to advise an acquirer, whether it's a private equity firm who is funded or an independent sponsor. Make their expertise available at the due diligence stage and also serving on the board. And finally, I believe that there is no reason why commercial banks would have consolidated to the extent to which they have. Investment banks have. Even private equity firms are getting larger and larger. And independent sponsors will continue to be the way they are now, preponderantly a very boutique type business. And I'm thinking about Allen & Company as a potential role model. They're a merchant bank, and maybe this will be a name in the future for independent sponsors once they reach a size, where basically they become a federation of talented professionals who eat what they kill, and they get together to do business done in a high-quality professional manner. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Dan. That is a helpful perspective. We appreciate that. I've asked Conor Mullet. Conor's been on both sides of working from a for a family office and from a funded capacity, and now he's now looking at the work from an independent sponsor capacity. And so, Conor, if you could maybe tell us about just kind of how the independent sponsor deal works and how the independent sponsor gets compensated for his or her efforts.
Sure. Do you want to? Thank you. Yes, that's a good point. I actually have sat on a bunch of different sides of the table, having worked at a financing provider, GE Capital, a large family office for 6 or 7 years, and then as a general partner with a private equity fund with having raised capital from large institutional investors. And I think in a lot of ways, the independent sponsor has been around for, a long time, sort of putting deals together. And if you go back to the early days of private equity, in a sense, the earliest guys in private equity, like even when KKR got started and, Westray, which was a predecessor firm to the family office that I worked for, those firms were actually firms that raised money on a deal-by-deal basis and, kind of built in economics for themselves. So, and I think what, on this slide, there are 2 points. I think the first is the process and I think the value proposition and then the process. from a value proposition perspective, the independent sponsor really has to, add value in the process and can't, just be participating in an auction, competing on price. I mean, it doesn't, the economics that independent sponsors want to garner from deals would not be justified under a scenario where there was not, the value add. And really, from our perspective, we see the value add, in a couple of different ways. First, I think it's, some element of sourcing things that are unique. That doesn't mean that you can't necessarily participate in an auction, but you have to be prepared to do something with the asset that, others might not be thinking about in order to, be able to be competitive and create value. That is, kind of, I think, then part of the second part of this slide, which is the process where, in some respects, I think anybody in the private equity world would tell you the process looks something like this in terms of sourcing deals up front, at attractive prices, having a strategy to do something with it, closing the deal, and then managing it going forward. But I think that, oftentimes there are situations where the target company, for whatever reason, isn't really ready to be viewed as an attractive prospect by kind of the general private equity industry at large. They are, there needs more work to be spent, in terms of, making the company kind of ready for prime time. And I think that's where, kind of the independent sponsor can get involved and be helpful in the process, really, because the independent sponsor, in some respects, and this is sort of what we found interesting about the model, almost can sort of be seen as someone who sits between the management team and the providers of capital and sort of works in a way that is, although many private equity firms are very collaborative and helpful with the management team, the relationship often, revolves around, the quarterly board meeting and reviewing performance, et cetera. What I think the independent sponsor can do is work more closely with the management team, between board meetings, working on strategy, playing a quasi-active role from an involvement perspective in the company, not to the point that Dan would have described as the entrepreneur, because I think, at least in our case, we want to have a portfolio of companies. But, we also align ourselves from an economics point of view with the management team in terms of having the same type of compensation or equity ownership in the company that they would, rather than, some form of preferred stock or something, which you'd find in a, typical private equity deal. And I guess we've at least found that alignment seems to resonate with managers, CEOs of companies. But as far as the process itself is concerned, I mean, ideally, in terms of the transaction, if to the seller or the entrepreneur, it should look similar. I mean, there's a sourcing process and a negotiation process around, figuring out what the economics of the deal are. There's a due diligence phase that, looks a lot like any other private equity due diligence phase. And then there's, kind of a level of activity going forward. And as I've said, we kind of feel like we're kind of between the management team and the capital providers in terms of rolling up our sleeves. And, at least from our perspective, we're kind of flexible in terms of, capital providers who we work with. We're, happy to work with folks who want to, be active in the company. We'd like to do more of the work just to justify the economics for ourselves and, kind of being the, the first call and working with management. But, from an actual process and closing, I mean, it should be, pretty seamless and similar to, another kind of any other transaction process. On the next slide, this is just a quick summary of, what the compensation schemes are for independent sponsors. And when we first got involved with this, we actually found we weren't, we'd heard a few things and we weren't necessarily, but hadn't done a deal, having come from a fund. But we found that there is, a market, I think, broadly for independent sponsor compensation, as you can see on this slide, really consisting of origination fees, monitoring fees, and then some form of equity carried interest in the company. And, the deals can really vary. I think the way we've approached it is to try to be flexible. These, what I've outlined here on this slide, I think, is what we found to be kind of out there in the market in terms of a range of compensation. And sometimes, on the fee side, there are certain capital partners who want to share in the fees, others who don't care about the fees. So I think it kind of depends who you're working with. And then on the equity side, some level of base ownership, after a return of capital, perhaps with a preferred return, and then maybe some tiered incremental equity based upon performance. And again, we've negotiated, arrangements with a variety of folks, and they all, kind of look like this, but, different people have different hot buttons, and so we try to be flexible. And then I guess the last piece is, for the, kind of transaction expenses, this is a sensitive one for, independent sponsors because we don't have, a management fee to set up to cover, busted deals, and until you kind of get a level of fee income up and running, you're really operating out of your own pocket. So, the interest and willingness for a partner to assume, some or all of the broken deal expenses, I think is important. And I think, look, generally we are, and I think most, independent sponsors would be cognizant of the sensitivity to manage expenses in such a way in the transaction where you're not running up a big, legal bill or accounting bill or something until the deal's sort of far enough along where you feel like there's a good chance it's going to close to mitigate that risk.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Conor. I guess actually, Nick, could you go back one slide real quick? We got a couple of questions and clarifications that have come in. One question was about fees and who are they negotiated with? Are they negotiated with the target company or with the capital partner?
I mean, I guess in our experience, it's a little bit of both. I think it's, and others may have a different view, but, especially in a controlled transaction, it's probably more part of the, kind of the new owners that are the ones you really have to be sensitive to. But obviously, I think you have to, the fees have to be set at such a level to, and the value added and involved has to be clear so that it makes sense for the company in terms of, because oftentimes sellers and managers are continuing equity owners.
Right. And again, I appreciate you putting these three boxes out here. I think they're useful. I guess my comment, I think we probably see a little bit broader range, maybe I think we've seen, origination fees above 2%, and I guess we've seen monitoring fees kind of below the 2.5%. But I think these are pretty good ballpark numbers for folks to think about. So thanks, Conor. I appreciate it. Nick, if we can move forward, a couple other questions that have come in, which I think some of them will get to what Chris is going to talk about here, the advantages and disadvantage of the independent sponsor model. Some folks are kind of wondering, why, if you could raise a fund, why wouldn't you? And Chris, maybe tell us a little bit about, some of the flexibility you may have as an independent sponsor, and maybe some of the challenges as well.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Chris. We're going to jump back real quick. We passed over a slide since I'm not in control of them, so just very quickly to conclude on Skyline, since founding the firm just over 3 years ago with my two partners, we've closed 3 portfolio investments which are listed here. In those 3 companies, we've deployed over $100 million in equity in conjunction with our equity partners. The first is a company called Captech Softgel, which is a combination of healthcare and a manufacturing business. They contract manufacture and distribute specialty nutraceuticals. The second is a software and healthcare business called IMDsoft, which is a worldwide leader in high acuity clinical information systems for hospitals, specifically focused on the ICU and the OR. And the third is called DCRX Infusion, which is a healthcare business that is a specialty infusion pharmacy for dialysis patients. So, Nick, if we jump back to my slides then. The first slide is the advantages of the independent sponsor model. So in preparing for this topic, I considered a couple different target audiences for this webinar to include independent sponsors, capital partners, and intermediaries and service providers. In other words, there are different parties to independent sponsor transactions that may view the independent sponsor model differently, and so you have to take into account the different perspectives of each of those parties. From an independent sponsor perspective, the advantages of the model are being able to build a firm from the ground up. Many individuals leave prior firms, whether it be in private equity, investment banking, or otherwise, and want to be able to build their own future and create their own firm. The second is flexibility. We aren't necessarily governed by traditional private equity fund documents that restrict what types of deals you can focus on. So we're actually able to be pretty nimble and consider a range of opportunities that we might not otherwise be able to do so. The third advantage is speed. We ourselves as a firm consist just of 3 partners, and so we are able to move very quickly on transactions, make decisions quickly, and so that's very advantageous relative to a traditional private equity firm. The fourth is there's significant dry powder out there. Among the limited partner and general partner community, there's over $1 trillion of dry powder out there available for investment. So if you find good deals and price and structure them well, you likely will be able to find equity capital to help consummate your transaction. Another advantage of the model is being able to leverage your equity partners' resources and capabilities. As I said, we operate quite leanly. We're able to wear many different hats, but many of these firms that we work with and partner with have extensive resources from an HR, operations, and industry perspective that we're able to leverage as we pursue transactions together. Another advantage of the model is avoid having to raise and administer a dedicated fund. When we formed our firm just over 3 years ago, we decided to build the firm based on an independent sponsor model. We did not want to spend 12, 18, 24, 36 months trying to raise capital as a new firm in the market. I recently spoke with a placement agent last week who said at present, there are over 2,000 funds currently raising capital in the market. That's a lot of other funds to compete with, and it's a lot of time, effort, and hassle. Again, our view was there's sufficient capital out there if you find good deals and price and structure them well. And a final advantage of the model is reasonable economics. So we're able to approach economics in line with other private equity firms along the 2 and 20 perspective as a result of our transactions. From a capital partner perspective, this could include equity investment firms, mezzanine debt firms, and senior debt providers. From an equity investment perspective, this could include raising capital from both limited partners, such as family offices, as well as general partners, which is other private equity firms. The advantages of the independent sponsor model to the capital providers is, 1, proprietary deal flow. We work very hard to generate unique proprietary investment opportunities for our capital partners. We try very hard to avoid auctions unless we feel we've got differentiable value and perspective and resources and capabilities that we can bring to bear on a given transaction which help differentiate us from other buyers, whether it be other private equity firms, other independent sponsors, or other direct investment firms. A second advantage of the model is being able to work with a value-added investor and partner. We go to great lengths to provide significant strategic value add to our investors. That includes bringing in additional management team members, bringing in additional board members. In fact, in 3 of our closed investments to date, we've recruited a new CEO and CFO in all 3 situations. And so that's an example of the type of work we can do. We populate our boards with value-added industry and operations executives, and we also introduce customer, supplier, and partner relationships that can bring value to the portfolio company and our equity partners as well. We also have a track record in private equity, and having been in the independent sponsor world for the past 3 years, are viewed as credible from that perspective, which helps get our equity partners comfortable with the transactions we're bringing to the table. A third advantage of the model for capital partners is expedited deal timing. We often are bringing a transaction to our partners that is locked up under LOI, and so they avoid having to court the target over a 3, 6, 9, or longer month period. So we're bringing a transaction that's identified, negotiated, and locked up to the benefit of our capital partners. From an intermediary and service provider perspective, the advantage of the model is for an intermediary, we represent a potential buyer for their client. So we are credible, we've got a track record, we've got unique perspective on the business, and that allows us to compete effectively in a limited auction process. From a service provider perspective, we obviously represent a prospective client for them, and so that's a value-add advantage for them. And finally, having built a track record as a firm, we're viewed as a value-added investor for the intermediary and their client, and as a partner along with the service provider. Next slide, please. Thanks. In terms of the disadvantages of the independent sponsor model, the first is the challenge, which is really selling the target company and their intermediary. This is probably one of the greatest challenges we face when we're looking at transactions, which is painting a picture and telling a story about our firm, our track record, our industry knowledge, our operating expertise, and relationships that allow us to be effective buyers of this business and to help them grow the business and take it to the next level. We do not compete in auctions to the greatest extent possible, but to the extent we do end up in a situation like that, we often have to convince the intermediary of the same. So they want to know who we are and what our resources and capabilities are so that they can communicate it effectively to their client, the target company. Another disadvantage of the independent sponsor model is having to raise capital deal by deal. Obviously, we aren't spending time up front to raise a dedicated fund, so having to raise capital deal by deal presents its own challenges. My partners and I, having been in the private equity world for the past 40 years, have significant relationships on both the limited partner and the general partner side. And so while we do have to raise capital deal by deal, often on an expedited basis, within a matter of a few weeks, we're able to do that pretty efficiently given our track record and the relationships we have out there. The third issue is being subject to our equity partners investment committees. These are partnerships, and there's a significant amount of trust involved in pursuing these relationships together. We often are in alignment with our investment partner from that perspective, but occasionally issues may pop up where we may have a different perspective than they do, and we have to work through those issues to try and get to a closed transaction at the end of the day, while recognizing there will be bumps in the road, and we need to align ourselves in terms of agreeing on issues that may pop up as part of a transaction. Another issue is rules of engagement. So it's important to understand as an independent sponsor, we're going to work with our equity partner. That includes How are we going to negotiate and propose an LOI if we haven't already gotten to that stage? How are we going to interact with the target company and the intermediary? How are we going to go through the lender process, et cetera? And so it's important to lay those rules of engagement out up front with your capital provider so there's not a misunderstanding as you proceed through the process. Another issue is governance. Oftentimes, we are writing a smaller check and our equity partner is writing a larger check. So in most cases, our equity partner would like control of the board. We understand and appreciate that. We do ask for a seat at the table, typically consisting of 1 or 2 board seats. We want to be viewed as value-added investors who are bringing value to the table of the portfolio company and our equity partner. We're also looking to build a track record as an independent firm ourselves. And so governance is important to us, having a seat at the table while recognizing our equity partner may ultimately want control of the board.
Hey, Chris, could you,
another issue,
we're running a little short on time. I wonder if you could just hit the high points of your other 2 major bullet points.
Sure. Another issue is expedited deal timing in terms of having to work very quickly once we lock up the transaction and bring our equity partner on board. And finally, negotiated economics, which is every term sheet we have seen, having been in the business for over 3 years, looks differently, and we just have to take that into account when we're selecting an equity partner. From a capital partner perspective, the disadvantages of the model are, 1, we could be viewed as competition for deal flow, but if we're bringing quality proprietary deals to the table, that should be less of an issue. Rules of engagement and governance I've already discussed. Expedited deal timing I've discussed as well, but from a capital partner perspective, they need to be able to operate quickly once we bring them a transaction locked up under LOI so that we can get through due diligence together and close on a timely basis in line with the expectations of the target company. Alignment of incentives is important so that we're both focused on the long-term performance of the business. And from a capital partner's perspective, we are bringing a unique proprietary opportunity to the table. In return for that, we're asking for a share of the economics, which hopefully they understand and appreciate. Finally, from an intermediary and service provider perspective, you have unfunded versus funded sponsor dynamics, such as what is your ability to close, what is your track record, and what is your timing in order to consummate a transaction. And from a rules of engagement perspective, an intermediary will want to understand, how do I work with the independent sponsor, how do I work with their equity partner, and how do they interact with me as the intermediary as well as with my client. And finally, from a service provider perspective, who is selecting, engaging, and paying the various service providers. And it's important as well from an independent sponsor perspective to obtain information rights to the work product that's being generated by the service providers. And it's important to lay that out up front. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Chris. And as we've been talking here, we've been getting a number of questions in from people about kind of how an independent sponsor can compete and how an independent sponsor can convince a business owner to maybe go with them, particularly if there happens to be a private equity group somewhere around the process, or even if not. And so, Grant, I think that's a good transition to you to talk about how how independent sponsors compete with funded private equity groups. And just real quick, on the topic of timing, I know we're I promise we get done at the end of the hour, and for folks that need to drop off, that's okay. We may go a little bit over. I want to make sure we got a bunch of good questions coming in, and I want to take a couple minutes at the end to address some of those. But Grant, maybe if you could again talk about your piece here.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. I'll try to be brief. I know we're short on time. I guess this is the million-dollar question for independent sponsors: is how do you compete with private equity groups or funded sponsors? If you can pop to the next slide. We try not to compete with them, and I think some other speakers today have highlighted this already. I think to be successful as an independent sponsor, you got to create your own proprietary deal flow. If you're out just trying to compete in full auctions, I think you're going to have a tough road to go on there. one of the things that we try to do when we are in a competitive situation is build deep relationships with the sellers and owners. As one of the folks mentioned, oftentimes we are the layer between the capital partners and the management team or the seller owner. And a lot of times independent sponsors are kind of cut from the same cloth, especially in the lower middle market. You know, we're business owners, we're entrepreneurs. We really relate well with sellers and owners, so that makes it a little bit easier for building deep relationships. But I think in today's world, it's really hard to be a generalist from an independent sponsor's perspective. Private equity groups and funded sponsors are investing a lot of time and effort and talent in really being experts in the verticals they focus on. So if you don't have a checkbook in your back pocket and you don't know a lot about an industry, it may be hard to compete as an independent sponsor. So I think the best way to compete is to focus on industries you know. As Dan mentioned, a really powerful tool in today's world for an independent sponsor is to bring in an industry executive that's well respected in that industry. It's especially helpful if it's a more competitive environment. It could be a great differentiating point when a seller owner is considering your proposal. But at the end of the day, you got to present yourself differently. Private equity groups have a lot of great skill sets, talents, and track records, but they tend to look at every opportunity as a transaction, and that can be a little off-putting sometimes to sellers and owners. So as an independent sponsor, you know, you can spend more time getting to know owners and sellers and present yourself differently than the traditional funded sponsors. If you flip to the next slide. If you do have to compete, the best way to do it is to have your capital figured out early. And I think when you talk to independent sponsors, you say, hey, when do you find your capital partners? You'll get a lot of different answers. Some people like to wait till they have an LOI signed. Some like to get them involved early when they're making their bids or proposals. We believe that the more competitive the environment, you have to figure out your capital early on so that's not an issue and that the intermediaries and sell-side folks feel good about your proposal. I put together a couple tips for independent sponsors and some tips for private equity groups for how to do this. For the independent folks out there, we found that if you have some good relationships with a group of equity partners up front that you can go to, it sure makes figuring out your capital early a lot easier. In doing so, it's really important to be honest. As an independent sponsor, you only make money by getting deals done, and there can be a perceived bias for an independent sponsor to get a deal done, and sometimes capital partners can feel like there's a trust issue there if an independent sponsor is not willing to walk away from a deal if it doesn't make sense. And as some other folks have mentioned, clearly defining roles and responsibilities is really important. When you're working with capital partners, every capital partner is different. They all have different needs, and in order to avoid confusing the sell side, it's important that everyone knows what their role is. For the funded folks out there, the private equity groups, it's really important to support your independent sponsors. Don't work around them, don't usurp them. It's really important you educate your independent sponsor about your process and what role is important to you so they can get your needs met. And you got to really look at yourself in a little bit different light. You got to support your independent sponsors so they can win the deal. This can be tough. Some funds are really good at it and some aren't. It can be a DNA issue. And more importantly, you got to be flexible and kind of be figuring out how to win a deal with your partner as an independent sponsor or with the independent sponsor. Chris, with that, I turn it over to you.
That's great, Grant. And maybe just a follow-up question. Again, some of the questions that one of the questions we've got from the group is you know, how and when does a target company know that you're a you know, quote unquote fundless sponsor? I know that word sometimes has a negative connotation here, but you know, how do you disclose that?
We're usually very upfront about it, and we always want to have our capital figured out, so it's never a question for the seller owner. And ultimately, they generally kind of welcome it. I think as Conor mentioned, our economics are very much aligned with the management team post-transaction, so we can be a great advocate for the people who are continuing to carry the torch. So we try to be upfront and transparent about it.
Okay. Great. Well, a couple other questions here, and I think, Nick, the kind of the last slide is you know, something that I guess that I think Grant tried to answer in some ways, and others have as well, given their perspective, is why work with an independent sponsor. I'll let everybody take one last shot at answering that, but before that, I got just a couple other questions that have come from the audience here. One, are there any broker-dealer registration requirements to receive a closing fee? I'll throw that out to anyone. I think I know the answer, but...
Well, I mean, I can tell you that's Dan Negrea. We have very good legal counsel, and we are told that there is no such requirement.
Yeah, I haven't come across that either, so I think that I would agree with that. One in this, I almost hesitate asking this because you know we could talk for hours about it, but maybe Conor, if you just want to talk briefly about this, you know, what are the most successful strategies for developing proprietary deal flow? Or anybody can take that.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I guess for us, it typically starts with a sector focus. I think others talked a little bit about this, and really for us, it's, you know, kind of looking for opportunities in areas where we know and we can be value added. And I think, you know, in terms of being a credible investor in a company, whether you're an independent sponsor or a funded sponsor, I mean, I think today, you know, that sort of sector knowledge and ability to add value is really a prerequisite. So I guess that's really how we start in terms of, you know, looking at things in areas where we have a depth of expertise. You know, both my partner was an operating guy for 20 years, ran companies in technology, and, you know, I've been an investor for, you know, 20 years in the space. So that's helpful. And then I think, you know, being proactive around trying to find, you know, kind of all the sort of deals in the nooks and crannies, and, you know, interacting with lots of, I mean, there's a huge intermediary community out there that, you know, we try to interact with, stay top of mind on, and, you know, just leverage our network. I mean, it's a lot of, you know, I wish there was a magic bullet or like a magic pill for proprietary sourcing, but it's really, you know, just, you know, turning over a lot of rocks and talking to a lot of people.
Okay, great. Anyone else with any other comments on that?
Well, let me. That's Dan Negrea. Let me try to give a different perspective on this. Most statistics that I've seen show that the middle market has roughly 85 to 90% of the transactions done in an auction process. So we've made a decision here not to focus on 10 to 15% of the market. We would love proprietary deals, don't get me wrong. But we feel that we should play the auctions. We should be active in auctions. And then we look at auctions, and there are auctions and there are auctions. And there are some investment banks that have literally tens and hundreds of bankers and offices around the country, and they run extremely efficient auctions. We totally stay away from those. But we are very interested in seeing deals from smaller investment banks and boutique, let's call them single shingle investment banks, spin-offs from larger investment banks, two very professional, very knowledgeable investment bankers who started their own shop. So these will be often inefficient auctions, or even if they are targeted auctions, so they don't think that they are inefficient, they think they're running them correctly, they're still limited auctions. The other thing we like are broken auctions. So by being involved in lots of auctions, we see also the broken auctions. So then if you step back and you look at the deals that we've actually done, I would say that 2/3 of them were either inefficient, poorly run auctions by investment bankers who didn't do a great job. and only or very limited auctions, and only a third were active, well-organized, efficient auctions.
Right. Okay, great. Well, again, in the interest of time here and making sure people can get on with their day, I guess maybe I'll take a stab at answering this last question. Why should someone work with an independent sponsor? We view it in a number of different advantages. One, most obvious, it's opportunities that we aren't otherwise seeing. This independent sponsor community has access to, in some cases it's a busted process that Dan's firm may be working on, or it may be a proprietary opportunity that Chris's firm, they've gotten to know an executive, or they're working in a particular sector. These are, at the end of the day, they're opportunities that we haven't otherwise seen. On top of that, we, very often independent sponsors will bring, great executives and operating partners to the picture. That's something that we're going to need to do anyway. If they've already done that work for us, then that just shortcuts a lot of time and aggravation and mitigates risk for us. And so, I guess the last thing I would add is that typically by the time we're brought in, we as a funded private equity group are brought in. The deal is if the LOI isn't signed up, it's not too far away. So it is almost by definition a live opportunity, and so we get pretty excited about that. Seeing a lot of things at earlier stages in the process that may or may not be going anywhere. The chances are that the independent sponsors brought a deal to a stage of maturity that where it's ready to move to the next stage, and so we are, we get pretty excited about that. So, clearly this market has evolved over the years and is maturing, and I think the status of independent sponsors has risen, and we wanted to make sure that everybody in the call today was educated on exactly who this group is, where they're coming from, what they're doing, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages, and so I thank each of our attendees today. I thank Opus for organizing this and Accord for sponsoring it with it, and I thank everyone for their time today. Nick, I'll let you close it.
Great, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to all our panelists. I really appreciate you guys coming out here and our attendees as well. What I'll now do is just a quick sort of debrief. Everyone who attended will be getting, when you exit out of this program, you'll be receiving a survey about the webinar. Please fill it out and just let us know how we did, what you thought. This is a new program we're doing in Opus Connect. We're very excited about it. We want to make sure it's exactly what you guys are looking for. You'll also receive an email in a couple of hours with contact information for our panel, so you can contact any of them individually if you'd like to learn more about it, if you'd like to, any sort of long-term networking. So please go ahead and take advantage of that. And then on Monday, we'll be receiving a link to the recording of today's webinar. So you can share it with your network, you can watch it yourself again, and you'll also be receiving a copy of all of these slides. If you have any questions about Opus Connect or about this webinar, please go ahead and feel free to contact me. Again, my information is there. It'll be on all the emails that you receive. If you're interested in joining Opus Connect long-term, qualified applicants are invited to attend 2 Opus Connect chapter meetings free of charge. So you'll receive our calendar events in that final email, and you can go ahead and take a look at that and see if there's any events in your area that you might be interested in. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you again to our panel for speaking today, and we hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, Nick.